Okay, very good. So, like I was saying, good afternoon, everyone. Glad that you all are here today. It's good to see you all again. Thanks so much for stopping by. And so, like I was explaining last week, was that in the first chapter, I asked you all to go ahead and start taking a look at it. Did you all notice that there's like pretty much the first half of the chapter is pretty much like a crash course in like Texas history? Have y'all noticed that pretty much the first half of the chapter is dealing with Texas history and a lot of that? So what I asked you all to do is I asked you all to, take a look at one of the previous lecture videos that I've done where we go over more of the history. So we're not going to go over the history that much in detail. We're going to kind of touch on it, of course. But again, I have a previous lecture video where I go a little bit more detail into the Texas history. Like I said, we were going to do that last week, but again, I was under the weather. But that's okay. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and start on chapter 1. We will touch on some of the history because it is important that we still go over the history together here, because as I was explaining last week, one of the major reasons as to why Texas has the unique political culture that it has, excuse me, is because of the fact that Texas has a very rich and unique history. I would put the state of Texas's history up against any state in the United States when it comes to um, the number of countries that Texas has been a part of, the fact that Texas had its own Revolutionary War, and even more recently, we've seen that Texas has had a very um, unique history when it comes to its economy and how its economy has become a lot more diversified and things like that. So we're gonna, excuse me, we're gonna touch on that here today as well as on Thursday here. So I just wanted for us to just kind of get on the same page in terms of how we're going to go about this when it comes to looking at the Texas history. Like I said, I will touch on the main portions of Texas history as well as how it relates to Texas's current political culture, and then we'll definitely focus more on Thursday. We'll focus more on the different types of political culture that we see in Texas and throughout other parts of the United States, so we can do a comparison here. So I think we should be able to, for sure, we should be able to finish chapter 1 by this week. So let me go ahead and share the screen really quickly, so that way we can go ahead and get started here. So hold on, give me just a moment. Excuse me. Like I said, I'm still not quite 100%, but I should be okay to be able to teach here today. Okay, let's go and start. Okay. Okay, everyone. So we're going to start with chapter 1 here, the context of Texas politics. I've always liked the cover of this book because it kind of gives you a contrast. It's a good comparison of the contrasting areas within Texas. So as you can see up here, this is the DFW area, which um, there's been some Texas memes, which we'll get into those memes here in a bit. There was this one meme I saw the other day where this intersection around here, this is the one that takes you down to like 35 going towards Waco, but then could also take you up north towards Denton, way, way more over here. It's not even in the picture. But there was a meme that I saw where like that intersection is so it's so difficult, right? It's so confusing because you've got like 4 or 5 different lanes. And so that's why it'd be pretty much impossible without GPS. I don't know how people did this 20, 30 years ago. But it is funny. And I have seen that intersection before. So when I saw that meme, I thought it was pretty funny. Like I said, we'll talk more about those memes. Then down here, of course, we've got the vast ranch lands and farming lands of Texas. So it does give a good comparison in terms of the way Texas is, because even though Texas has become a lot more urbanized with um, in terms of the top, if you look at the top 10 or even just the top 15, because I think Austin is almost in the top 10, but if you look in terms of the top US cities in terms of population, Texas has four of, let's say, the top 15. Texas has four of the top 15. Um, when you look at Houston, when you look at San Antonio, Dallas, and Austin, and so that just goes to show you just how urbanized Texas has become. But that's not the entire state, right? We still have vast amounts of rural areas throughout Texas. I've the last couple of years, as I've been driving to different colleges to try to get some adjunct opportunities. There's I've gone to a lot of these places. Like I've gone to some of these remote places, like over in Lubbock and Amarillo in the Texas Panhandle, as well as like places like Abilene and Cisco and all that, and then also going towards East Texas, like Lufkin and Nacogdoches, and all very different areas when it comes to terrain, but there are similarities when it comes to the politics of the area. Like I said, we'll talk more about that as we go through the chapter. But let's go ahead and start with the chapter objectives here. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so then we'll come back to the news here a bit. Okay, so the chapter 1 objectives are: by the end of this chapter, you should be able to give a brief account of the causes and consequences of the major events in Texas history, such as the Texas Revolution, slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, the cotton and oil industries, world wars, and the Depression, political changes from the Old South to modern Texas, and the state's evolution to a modern economy. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, right, in this one objective. This objective basically, like I was saying, the first part of the chapter basically gives you a crash course in Texas history. Now, I know a lot of you all have probably taken Texas history. I think it was in 7th grade, I think. I believe it's still being taught in 7th grade. But again, that's a long time ago for a lot of us, right? So this may be the last time that you'll ever hear about Texas history. So I'll, I'll definitely do my best to be able to recap that for you all. And so you all should have a little bit of working knowledge of this, especially when it comes like the Alamo, right? Everybody knows the Alamo, even though there's a lot of debate about the Alamo and all this, but we're not going to get into that. That's a whole other story. We could devote a whole course to that. I know there's been some books that have been written about it recently. But that's not really the main focus of what we're going to look at. The not necessarily what happened there, but the impact that the Alamo had in terms of what it did for the people of Texas is mostly what we're going to be talking about here. Because again, this is a government class, more not really a history class, although I do have a history background, so that's why I can definitely embellish on this a bit. Okay, then summarize democratic theory and the standards that it supplies us in order to permit us to evaluate the democratic legitimacy of any state or country. So now we're going to be getting more into political theory here in terms of what a democracy is and what are the components of a democracy, and also looking to see some of the factors that might influence whether democracy is healthy or not. Discuss whether it is desirable or even possible for Texas to have a foreign policy. So obviously, of course, Texas is in a unique situation where Texas shares an international boundary with Mexico, right? In fact, Texas has by far the longest international boundary of the other, in terms of the 4 states that border Mexico: California, Arizona, New Mexico, and then Texas. Texas has by far the longest of the border, right? Now, Texas also has some would say it's either it's kind of like a blessing or a curse. Some people, depending on who you talk to and whose opinion you hear, the fact that the boundary is a river is either a blessing or a curse. There's debate as to whether that's a positive or negative when it comes to border security. But the point is that Texas does have the longest border stretch between the states between the states and Mexico, and so that comes with unique challenges. And it also brings about this notion of, does the state of Texas have the right to do something about the border situation? And we're going to talk about in this class how this is a big political issue right now. Current Governor Greg Abbott has made this one of his top priorities when it comes to border security, with Texas sharing that border with Mexico. But the question is, does Texas have the right to get involved, or is border security strictly a federal issue? And that's a big debate, right? And we will talk about that within our class. There's a good 60 minutes interview that came out it came out about this time last year, or a little bit later. It was about a year ago, where 60 Minutes sat down with Governor Abbott and they were asking him these questions. So I'm definitely going to link that in the class if I haven't done so. And I definitely recommend for you all to watch that, because if we were teaching this class in person, I would definitely show that to you all. I do show that to my 2306 in-person classes. But since we're online, I'll definitely encourage you all to watch it here. But anyway, like I said, we will talk about more on that, not just in this chapter, but throughout the course, in terms of this unique situation that Texas is in due to sharing this international border with Mexico. Okay. Give a brief description of the 3 political cultures and explain how they apply to Texas. So I would definitely say that this is probably the most important aspect of this chapter, is to know the 3 political cultures. And some of y'all have probably already gone through this chapter and maybe the previous lecture videos, and you all have had a chance to take a look at what those three political cultures are. So what we'll do is we'll discuss them, we'll give examples, and we will also describe which of those three political cultures do we see in Texas. Do we see all three of them? Do we only see one? Do we see two out of the three? We're going to take a look at that here within our chapter. And we'll also take a look at how different parts of the state also might have more of these political cultures than others. Summarize the overall pattern of the relationship of Texas government to the Texas economy, and explain why it is difficult to determine if Texas is or is not a good place to live. Yes, and this is something that some of you all probably have had discussions with friends of yours and maybe family members, about the state of our state, right? In terms of, is the state doing well when it comes to the economy? And maybe it's doing well for some people, but is it doing well, for others, and things like that. So there are going to be some pros and cons to the way the Texas economy is set up, and we are going to take a look at that. How, unfortunately, one of the issues that we do see within Texas is that the social services, the funding for social services isn't very high compared to other states. We're also going to take a look at the property tax issue in Texas and how Texas has some of the highest property tax rates in the country. Because again, the chapter is going to talk about how Texas prides itself as being a low tax state, but we also have to take a look at it that it's low tax when it comes to certain taxes, such as Texas not having a state income tax. So yeah, Texas is one of the few states that does not have a state income tax. Normally, the norm is when you file your federal taxes in April, you're also supposed to file state income taxes. But Texas does not have a state income tax. But we're going to take a look at how the tax money has to come from somewhere, right? So it usually comes in the form of higher property taxes. So again, we're going to take a look at all this within this chapter and throughout the course here. And then discuss the ratio of Anglo, Latinos, and African Americans to the Texas population, and explain why these ratios matter to a book about state government. So yes, we are going to take a look at how particularly the Hispanic / Latino population had just really exploded in Texas, to where now there was an article that came out about a year ago, and I think I have it linked in the additional resources, but I'll double check on that. If not, I will for sure link it. It's an article that came out of the Texas Tribune, which that's another thing I also want to talk to you all about, is that I definitely recommend for you all to read up on the Texas Tribune. It's one of the few newspapers in Texas that you don't have to pay for. It's free, at least for now, and it's got amazing resources when it comes to news coverage of state and local affairs within Texas. It's definitely my go-to when it comes to reading up on what's going on in Texas. So it's called the Texas Tribune. That's the newspaper. Some of y'all may have heard of it. So I definitely recommend for you all to be familiar with that newspaper website, and I would recommend for you all to take a look at it every day to see what you can find when it comes to Texas news. I also Spectrum News also is a good source, although that one is, you do have to pay for it, but Spectrum News is also a good source. I also look at that. They also do a good job of covering state and local stories. Many years ago, there used to be this channel called TXCN, which is basically what Spectrum News is now. It's not the same company, but they used to do the same thing. They used to cover state news and things like that. So so I'm glad that now that we have that channel again, because now it's good that we're able to because when TXCN left, I was like, oh, like, how are we going to get our state news? And also, what also helps is that because Texas has been in the national spotlight, for a good number of years, being the second largest state in terms of size and population, you're definitely going to get a lot of national coverage of Texas. But like I said, the Texas Tribune is what I would recommend for y'all to look at if you want to take a look at state and local news in Texas. But anyway, we're going back to the objective here. There was an article in the Texas Tribune that came out about a year ago where the Latino population in Texas had eclipsed the Anglo population in Texas. So they were kind of neck and neck. They were both at about 40%, give or take. The Anglo population had been slightly larger than Latinos, but now the Latinos have become even more, they've slightly eclipsed the Anglo population. And then eventually, they're predicting that eventually the Latino population is going to become the majority population when it comes to being over 50% of the total population in Texas. That's going to take a little bit more time. So right now they're not the majority, they're just the largest. There's a difference between the largest group and the majority. The majority group would have to be at least, 50%. So we don't have a majority group right now in Texas, but they're predicting that the Latinos will become that majority group eventually in maybe a decade or so. So we'll see how that plays out. But right now, the Latinos are the largest population group in Texas. Like I said, I will look to make sure that that article is linked in the additional resources. But okay, so with that being said, does anyone have any questions on the objectives here? So again, like I said, as you can see, there's a lot that we have to cover. And like I said, since I was out last time, that kind of delays it a little bit, but that's fine. We're just going to go ahead and skim through on the history. And like I said, if you need to look more on the history, you can always also go to the other video that I did last year that goes more into detail on the history. But okay, anyway, let's go ahead and get started here if there's no questions. Let's take a look at this. So this is kind of funny, right? Because I'm sure some of you all are familiar with Texas memes and how have some of y'all seen some of those Texas memes? We'll take a look at this one and then I'll show you all a couple more. If you just do a quick Google search for Texas memes, you'll find there's tons of funny ones. But let's take a look at this one first, and then we'll move on to that one. So as you can see here, we've got not Texas, Texas, and not Texas. Does anyone know what this community is? Does anyone know where this is in the States? Does anyone want to take a guess in terms of what this dot is here? Does anybody know what city this is in Texas? Let's see what someone is in the chat. No, no, Bianca, Dallas is more towards here. Let me give you a hint. The traffic's bad in Dallas too. As I spent some time in Dallas this summer. Yeah, no, it's a little bit further south on I-35. Let me give you all another hint. It's the place where it's gotten very expensive in such a short amount of time, and there's just so many condos going up in the downtown area. Like, it's amazing how much it's changed in the last 20 years. Anyone want to take a guess at what city that is? Okay, Arlette says Austin. Bianca says yes. There you go. Yeah, Austin. That's correct. Yes, that is supposed to represent Austin here. Now, the reason why this is considered not Texas is because along with all of that economic growth that has happened in the Austin area, there's also been an influx of people that have been coming from other states, particularly the state of California over here. So what's been happening is that because you have a lot of transplants from California and some of these other states, they're also bringing their political viewpoints with them. So that has created a situation where the Austin area is looked at as being more liberal than other parts of the state, even more liberal than other metropolitan areas like Houston over here and the DFW area over here. Austin is looked at as kind of like another version of California in terms of the memes and how people view it. You've probably heard the phrase "Don't California my Texas." That's another one of those memes. So it goes into this now. This is kind of anecdotal data, though. What I mean by anecdotal is that it might be kind of hard to like really prove for sure that that's what's going on in Austin. That's just kind of like the general accepted theory that it's because of. Now, what is true is that a lot of Californians are moving to Texas. I don't think they're all gravitating towards Austin. But unfortunately, because there's been so many people that have, and not just from California, but because there's been so many people that have moved to Austin, that is what has contributed to the, yes, the rapid growth, but also the rapid increase in the cost of living. I mean, it's just sadly you can't afford to live in Austin anymore. I will show you all later on in the class how I've seen pictures of how they compared the skyline with in Austin. And yeah, I remember back about 20 years ago, I said this to y'all before, right? That clock tower over there, I forget what building that is, but that clock tower, it's on 6th Street. If you keep going on 6th Street past all the bars and all that, it'll take you to that building. Some of y'all probably familiar with that. So I drove through Austin a couple of weeks ago, and that building is tiny compared to the rest of the other buildings that are going up. Tons of building, well, not tons, but several buildings, that have the cranes, up top. There's a whole bunch of construction, and so that's just causing a situation where, unfortunately, a lot of the longtime Austin residents are getting priced out of their houses. So you can probably get a sense for how I feel about that. but yeah, that's one of the most popular memes in terms of people in Texas not liking what's going on in Austin and things like that. Now, let me show you all a couple of other ones here. Let me stop the screen and let me show you all a couple other ones here. So if you just do a simple Texas memes, just do a simple search on Google, you'll see what I'm talking about here. So just take a look at some of this here, right? So look at some of these memes, like United States of America. You mean Texas and its 49 sisters? You know, some of these are pretty funny. This one was it. So we can kind of make this one a little bit bigger than this one. Was it? How she thinks she looks versus how I think she looks, and then stop drinking Dr. Pepper. They, because Texans supposedly love their Dr. Pepper. They love their Bluebell ice cream. Are y'all familiar with some of these memes? Right, these are pretty funny, right? Let's see some of these other ones, like those 5 days in Texas when it's not 95 degrees. Meanwhile, in Texas, I mean, it's this one's also pretty funny here. I bet he's thinking about being his own country again. The Statue of Liberty. Why did it take one of her almost 70 years to make a Dr. Pepper flavored milkshake? So you can see like there's all kinds of memes, and then the Buc-ee's one also. That's another classic one, like where people in Texas are like obsessed with Buc-ee's, which I like Buc-ee's too. I stopped by there a couple of weeks ago when I was driving back from Dallas, to Austin. But it is very pricey. Let's see, there's something in the chat here. Ah, yes, Bianca. Yes, Bianca. Definitely, you're familiar with that. And then there's also the Texas meme size here. These are also pretty funny. Where like this one's pretty funny, right? Like where they fit like the whole world is in Texas, and then Texas is in Texas. So that's actually so that's pretty funny, right? Because Texans have this very they really love their state. That's kind of like the whole point of these memes, right? Is the Texans really love their state, right? And then also some more of these here, like here's a King of the Hill one, like where Texas is like super huge and all that stuff. But yeah, so these are pretty funny here. But let me also talk a little bit about where this kind of comes from, right? That this idea that that you know that the Texans really love their state. They have a lot of pride in their states. And obviously, of course, this comes from their unique history and the unique culture that we see in Texas, right? Like I said, not many states have been able to claim that they've been their own independent republic, and certainly not as long as Texas was. Texas was an independent republic for almost a decade. So you can see why people have a lot of pride in Texas and why they really love their state. I'll share a personal story that um, I think did I share this personal story last time? If I did, I'm sorry. It's because I teach so many of these classes. But basically, I went to New York a couple of years ago for a conference, and like I swear, like when people were asking me like where I was from, I don't normally talk with a Texas accent, but I swear it came out. I was like, I'm from Texas, like it came out, like it was like so funny, like what, like like I don't normally talk like that, but I guess because I was away from my state, I felt like like the me being from Texas, came out and things like that. And then later on, I'm also going to reference another story that happened on my trip to New York when we talk about the political cultures. But yes, definitely, it's very interesting, to see just how much Texans love their state, and that also goes into part of the discussion question, which we'll also go over here a little bit later on. So I wanted to just kind of go over that really quickly. So okay, all right. So let me go back to the share the screen here. So like I said, we're just going to now we're going to get a little bit into the history. So we're gonna run through this really quickly here, and we'll try to get through this as quickly as possible here. So again, so when we're looking at Texas history, what I want first to focus on here really quickly, of course, obviously focus on obviously, of course, there's a ton of Native American groups that we, can trace their ancestry back to Texas. Um, and also very unique in terms of the size of the state and the different locations, right? So when you have like the Caddo Native Americans over in East Texas, and then you have the Lapán Apaches over here in Southern Texas, you've got the Comanches over in West Texas, and then also the other Native American groups, close to El Paso, like the Pueblos and the Mescaleros and all them. Obviously, of course, huge diversity when it comes to the and of course it goes to the living conditions, right? The Caranco was also along the coastal bend, right? They were able to adapt to, well, they had to adapt, right? They had to adapt to to the terrain and the locations that they were living in. So that's why the Caddos over in East Texas, they had they were able to they were influenced by, the mounds and all that. And then of course the Comanches, they were constantly moving with the herds along the Texas plains, and so they had to have very temporary housing and things like that. So obviously, of course, huge influences. We do also see the beginnings, of course, of the Europeans coming over with the Spanish. Uh, the Spanish, of course, were the first Europeans to come to Texas with Pineda mapping the Texas coast, and then of course we had the unfortunate incident of Cabeza de Vaca, and him traversing through the Texas wilderness, ultimately making it back to Ciudad Mexico, and then of course we had the French incursion, with the founding of Fort St. Louis, and how the French, with the French trying to colonize Texas, that precipitated the Spanish to pay more attention to Texas, because Texas was basically considered kind of like this backwards part of New Spain. The way northeastern frontier, this area known as Texas, which was popularized by the Caddo, the Native Americans. That's where the term that's where the name Texas originally came from. Originally, this part of New Spain was called Nueva Santander. That was especially down here in South Texas. We were part of that part of the that was the official name of our location here in South Texas. So anyway, so the Spanish, of course, to make sure that the French would not move further west from New Orleans over there in Louisiana, what they would do is they would set up these settlements, and this is where a lot of the old time settlements, even here in South Texas, first were founded, such as Matamoros, Reynosa, Roma, and then of course going north towards. There was also a town called Revilla, which is where Zapata's at, and then of course Laredo, which was on both sides of the river. So if any of you have ever been to Laredo, obviously, of course, you know that you have two communities now, right? You've got Laredo, Texas, and then you have Nuevo Laredo. But back before before the Rio Grande became the border between the United States and Mexico, that was just one city, that was just one community. It's kind of like how in Austin, where you've got the Colorado River, which cuts through Austin, and then Waco is also another good example where the Brazos River cuts in between of Waco, right? So that's the way Laredo was, where it was just the Rio Grande was just it was just in the middle of that community. But then, of course, we'll talk about how ultimately that changes. We do have the three permanent, European settlements, um, with San Antonio, Nacogdoches, and all that. So of course, we start to see the beginnings of the missions and all that, right? And so this leads us, of course, obviously to the now we get more towards the beginning of Anglo Texas, right, where we have the non-Native American population rapidly expands, because you have to keep in mind um, that Texas was very sparsely populated. Most of the population was located more in modern day Mexico, and this wasn't just in Texas, but also because remember, if you remember from your history classes, that Mexico controlled a large portion of the American Southwest. Well, at first it was New Spain, and then Mexico gained their independence um, there in 1821. And so you have what you have here is you have the northern territories that are sparsely populated, hardly anybody's living there. It's still mostly Native American controlled. And so the idea was, in terms of why the Spanish and then ultimately the Mexicans were in favor of allowing for originally Moses Austin, but then he passed away. He succumbed to illness, and then his son Stephen took on took on this project that his father was pioneering here. One of the main reasons as to why first the Spanish and then the Mexicans were cool with the Americans coming over is that they believed that the United States had their eyes on Texas. Again, this was during the time of Manifest Destiny and moving westward. Of course, back in the United States, we had the Louisiana Purchase, and and of course, we had the Lewis and Clark expedition traversing across the vast terrain of the recent Louisiana Purchase. And then also we had the Oregon Trail, right, moving towards Oregon. Like I said, this is just very, very basic history. We could definitely take more time to go more detail on, but I'm just giving you just the broad overview. So obviously, of course, the trend is that the United States is moving westward. So obviously, what the idea was is that they felt that the Mexicans felt that if they would welcome the Americans to populate Texas, that would create kind of like a buffer zone where the United States would kind of bypass Texas and kind of, not, try to outright, purchase it and take control of it, but would instead kind of act as like a buffer zone between both countries here by having both, Mexicans and Americans, kind of living together there in that shared area there in Texas. So that was the original plan as to why the Mexicans were okay with the Americans coming over. Right now, so I do understand where they're coming from, um, but it didn't work because of these expanding cultural differences, which we're talking about right here. So Stephen F. Austin, he's able to bring over the original 300 families to Texas. He acts as the impresario. Basically, he's the chief land administrator, and he's responsible for issuing out the land grants and making sure that the owners are adhering to the requirements set forth by the Mexican government. So he's basically the chief administrator. Um, and so there were certain requirements that the Americans had to follow. Now, also keep in mind, and I've got there's some good YouTube videos that I also have for you all to watch if you all have time. It's the Fathers of Texas, and it talks about this a little bit more in detail, where the major the major the major reason for why Americans were so interested in moving to Texas was because the land was so cheap. It was extremely cheap to live there. Just basically a fire sale price in terms of how much land you could get, for such a little price. And of course, it also helped that the weather was, pretty decent compared to where they were coming from, especially like more towards, the eastern part of the United States. So a lot of people, were very interested in coming to Texas, and so the population definitely increased. The problem, though, was that there were these very major differences. So you see these differences between like northern North America and like southern North America going into Central America and even South America, right? That because they were colonized by two different two very different countries, with Great Britain colonizing the northern part of the continent and Spain colonizing the southern part. You see these big time cultural differences when it comes to language, English versus Spanish, religion, uh, Protestantism versus Roman Catholicism, right? And the religion also, if you go back to U.S. history, keep in mind that Protestants were not fans of Catholics at all. It's not as pronounced as it is today, but back then, like that was a major difference. Like they regarded Protestants would regard Catholics as basically being a different religion, right? Like it was that much of a difference, right? And then also, of course, the slavery issue. Um, Mexico had outlawed slavery, but obviously, of course, a lot of the people coming over to Texas were from the American South, where they had slaves already, so they were bringing them forth, and then they were also bringing forth the cotton industry also to Texas, because Texas had a similar climate as the southern states like Louisiana and all that. So they were bringing their culture as well as the peculiar institution, as it's called, slavery, right? So you can see the issues, right? Because the requirements were that the Americans had to learn Spanish and they had to convert to Roman Catholicism. Because also keep in mind that there's no freedom of religion in Mexico at the time, right? It's not like here in the United States where there is no official religion, but over there in Mexico they did. So this creates growing tensions. Um, there's very few Mexicans that are living in Texas. It becomes a hugely majority Anglo population, and so you can see what's going to happen, right? That yes, the Mexicans are in charge, but because there are so many of these Anglos coming over with their different viewpoints and their different cultural differences and the different philosophy, it's not a surprise that ultimately we have war here, right? And so ultimately Mexico tries to kind of rein back the immigration. They cut off the immigration with the law of 1830. They they conjoin Texas with Coahuila, so then the capital, it becomes Saltillo. And so if you needed to get official state business done, you would have to go all the way to Saltillo. I mean, Saltillo, is probably about like, I think like 2.5, maybe like 3 hours away from here. So if you imagine, it's far from here, but then imagine if you're coming all the way from like the modern day Houston area, right? Or even like Nacogdoches, it would take you like weeks. The whole journey would take you weeks. And again, this is before cars, right? So these are covered wagons. It would take you a long time to get there and get back. So So ultimately, of course, we have the Texas War for Independence. Originally, Stephen F. Austin was not in favor of war here. He was trying to reconcile those differences. He wanted representation there within the Mexican Congress, but unfortunately, this is also during the time when Santa Anna came to power, and he was consolidating national power. And also keep in mind, and I learned this in one of my graduate history classes, that it wasn't just Texas that revolted. Other states in Mexico were also revolting against Santa Anna because they did not believe that the centralized government of Mexico should have that much power. And we'll talk about how this was an issue between local control versus strong strong central control. Here's another interesting point about the Texas Revolution that a lot of people maybe miss is that there's a lot of similarities between the Texas Revolution and our own US Revolution. Because if you think about it, if you think of the US Revolution, yes, they happened for the the reasons were a little bit different. But in terms of the general sentiment and the major grievance when it came to not being able to get their grievances heard, you see that in both the US Revolution and the Texas Revolution. Because like I said, yes, obviously, of course, issues with taxation and trade, that was, the major issues surrounding the American Revolution. And then in Texas over here, it's, the issue of slavery and the issue, and things like that. So there are some differences, but in terms of this idea that, hey, we're not cool with this overbearing monarch slash dictator slash president, whatever, when it comes to King George III and Santa Anna, we're not cool with either of those people basically taking power from the local governments, because the way that both Great Britain and Mexico used to administer their states was that they would let the local leaders basically handle everything because the empire was just too vast, especially when it came to the British Empire. There's no way that the king could make all those decisions like in India and over to Canada and the United States and all those territories in between. So you had to give up control. Well, not give it up, but you had to basically let the local leaders handle those everyday things. So once the rulers were basically taking more of that power away from the locals, that's when the locals started to say, no, we're not going to go along with that. And so we also saw that here within Texas, right, where, like I said, the law of 1830, the immigration was stopped, and slavery was attempted to be curtailed. And so ultimately we have Texas ultimately decides to revolt. You've probably seen the flag, right? The come and take it flag there with the cannon there. They're in Goliad. So that pretty much kicks off the start of the Texas Revolution. Of course, we obviously have the siege of San Antonio, the Battle of the Alamo here, which again, we're not going to get too much into detail in terms of the weeds of it, but just obviously, of course, know that obviously Santa Anna is able to ultimately defeat the Texans. He then moves east towards modern day Houston. And this, of course, is where Sam Houston comes, right? Who is looked at as, he's considered as the father of Texas. Former governor of Tennessee, also served in Congress. So he came over to Texas, was able to purchase land in the Nacogdoches area, but then he sells off that land to become the leader of the Texas Army. And ultimately, he is successful in defeating Santa Anna because his goal is to tire out Santa Anna, let his forces basically become depleted and tired, and basically try to wait them out there within East Texas. And so ultimately, they ambush Santa Anna. They're defeated very quickly, and then Texas is able to gain its independence. Right. So Texas, of course, has an unstable independence. Totally plagued with insurmountable war debt. Not too different from the United States when they gained their independence from Great Britain. So Texas just don't have the money to be able to succeed as an independent republic. And ultimately, one of the major goals after Texas gained their independence was to try to become part of the United States. And it makes a lot of sense, right? Because there's a lot of American citizens living in Texas, so they still have ties to the United States. So yeah, it definitely makes sense that that would be one of their main priorities. But Texas would wait. Texas would have to. So Texas gained their independence in 1836. They would have to wait until 1845 to ultimately become admitted into the United States as the 28th state. And it was for a political reason for the most part, because keep in mind that at this time, the slavery issue is the major issue that is, that's the major political question of the day is what do we do about slavery? And then you start to see, of course, more of this, this issue become even more pronounced, and ultimately that would lead us to the Civil War, uh, 15 years later after this. But the issue here is that the the Congress was very hesitant to admit Texas because Texas would obviously be admitted as a slave state, being in the South and being that there were already slaves there. So that would mean that Texas would gain two additional uh, senators that would be on the side of the slavery issue, right? That would be, for pro-slavery, right? So they would gain two senators. So that would upset the balance of power within the Senate. For those of you who have taken Texas government, you'll be familiar. I'm sorry, for those of you who have taken U.S. government, you definitely understand why this is important, right? Why the U.S. Senate is extremely important. So maintaining a balance of free states and slave states was a political move to try to ensure that we could try to still compromise on the issue, because the overwhelming idea, at least the centrists and the moderates, the people that wanted to try to maintain peace and order here, was to try to balance that out. Also, keep in mind that we had the nullification crisis in South Carolina, where South Carolina was basically threatening to leave the Union because of the slavery issue to begin with. This happened before the Civil War. So obviously, of course, tensions are high within the government as to the volatility, the volatileness of the slavery issue. So to make it work, to make the math work, Texas would have to be admitted at the same time as a free state. So that would be Oregon. So Oregon was then admitted pretty much at the same time as Texas. So you would balance it out. I don't know if that makes sense. Does that make sense in terms of trying to balance out the Senate? Where so if Texas gains two, senators that would be in favor of slavery, you would also have to get two other senators from a free state. So that's why Texas. It took a while for Texas to get admitted. Okay, all right. So obviously, of course, many of y'all probably have been to the Alamo there in San Antonio. Very, very historic. Okay, so now let's move on to the Mexican-American War. So this one hits home a bit because the epicenter of the Mexican-American War, at least where it started, was here in the Valley, here in South Texas. Now, let me also mention another interesting tidbit is that so when people talk about you have the Six Flags of Texas, there actually were a couple of places in Texas that could claim that they had seven flags. One of them over in Nacogdoches with the Fredonia Republic, as well as down here in South Texas, where we had the Republic of the Rio Grande. Now, for those of you who are in the Valley, probably know that there's like this really famous restaurant that's there on 10th and 83. But again, the restaurant is named after the Republic of the Rio Grande, which had its capital in Laredo, and it existed for almost a year when ultimately it was put down by Mexican forces. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So, because you might say, like, wait, Mexico, why is Mexico putting down the Republic of the Rio Grande? Well, let me give you a little bit of background. So, when Texas gains its independence from 1836, there is still disputes about where the boundary is with Mexico. Now, Texas asserts that the boundary is at the Rio Grande, whereas Mexico asserts that the boundary is at the Nueces River, which is that's where Corpus and George Weston, Three Rivers. That's why every time I drive by it, I always think to myself, wow, like if Mexico had their way, then this would be like I'd be crossing, like the internet, like there'd be like the I'd be crossing the international border right here, right? It's just kind of like a little like history, like just a history thought here. But anyway, so that's the disputed area. So because it's disputed, Mexico still maintains control here in South Texas. Texas doesn't really have any presence here in South Texas. So in cities like Laredo, like things pretty much go on as normal. Like even though you had what happened over there over in San Jacinto in 1836, up until 1845, a lot of people, basically people here in South Texas still think they're part of Mexico. Things don't really change. It's kind of interesting, right? It's interesting to think about that for 10 years, South Texas is still pretty much part of Mexico. Now that changes when Texas becomes part of the United States. So now the United States military can get involved because again, Texas didn't have the resources to really adequately defend that border, but now the United States does. So we see the sending of troops down to Brownsville. And again, this causes consternation with the Mexicans. So you have the beginnings of the Mexican-American War that happened here in South Texas, such as the Thornton Affair, which was a skirmish that happened a couple of days before the Battle of Palo Alto and the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. So those are the first official battles uh, where you would have future President Zachary Taylor would be involved there, and then he would. And of course, he would move on to other battles like the Battle of Monterrey. We also had Winfield Scott, who landed in Veracruz and made his way up into Ciudad Mexico and ultimately defeated the Mexicans in about 2 years, right? So Mexico just did not have a chance against the United States. A lot of, like I mentioned, some of those names sound familiar. Other names, such as Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, also served in the U.S. military in the battle in the Mexican American War, and of course we would know what happened with them a couple years later with the Civil War, right? But anyway, so Mexico is defeated, and then not only is the border now solidified with Rio Grande, but again, the United States also gains the other territory. California had also briefly gained their independence with the Fremont Republic. But again, all of that territory in between Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, as well as portions of Wyoming, they become part of the United States now. So that closes the book on Mexico here. Then we move on to the beginning of political parties. So originally, Texas did not really have political parties during their independent republic stage. It was basically just the pro Sam Houston versus the anti Sam Houston camps. But then Sam Houston, of course, still being highly regarded as the father of Texas, he becomes a senator in Texas, and then he does get into some controversy later on because during the Kansas-Nebraska Act debate, which was again, and now we're getting into some Civil War history that what was going on in the Kansas Nebraska area was that that was kind of like the battleground for were these areas going to become free states or free territories or slave territories, because the idea was that um, the popular idea at the time was to let the people decide whether they would for them to vote for themselves whether they would become free or slave. But what was happening was that you had people coming from slave Missouri moving over there to try to create a slave territory, and then you had people from free Illinois coming there. So you had all this bloodshed. You had it was literally like a bunch of fighting that was going on, like in Lawrence, Kansas. You had there was a situation where a an anti-slavery newspaper was ransacked, and there was just, again, look this up. It's just very, very brutal what was going on in Kansas and Nebraska. So the idea was that, okay, well, if the people decide, and then they even had like fake capitals, like the pro-slavery Kansas people had their capital, the the anti-slavery people had their capital. So it was just a big old mess. But Sam Houston gets a little bit of trouble here because he votes against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was going against his Southern compatriots. So he gets booted out of the Senate, because remember, back then it was the Texas legislature that decided who the senators were. It's not like today where we vote for senators directly. Back then it was supposed to be the state legislature. So if he pissed off the state party, there's no way that Sam Houston would ever be able to be allowed to go back to serve in Washington. But then he gets elected to be governor of Texas. He had originally been the president of Texas, but then he becomes governor. So Sam Houston is governor at the time that Texas joins the Confederacy. So you have the Texas Secession Convention of 1861, where Texas overwhelmingly votes to join the Confederacy. Sam Houston does not go along with it, so he gets removed from office, and then he passes away a couple of years later. So then Texas, of course, is part of the Confederacy. Texas, as the book mentions, Texas does not see a lot of the fighting, at least in Texas. Most of the fighting, of course, happens to the east, although Texas did send many infantry units, as part of the the Confederate Army here. There are several battles here in Texas, such as the Battle of Sabine Pass. There's also other battles, such as because there was a group led by Sibley, who was trying to conquer New Mexico and Colorado and move towards California to try to take it, because the idea was that if the Confederacy was able to take control of California, that would make them more legitimate in the eyes of some of the more powerful countries like England and France, right? So the Confederacy was trying to gain legitimacy on the world stage, but ultimately that was That did not prove successful. The Pikes over in Colorado, they pushed back Sibley's forces back down to Texas. But again, Texas doesn't see too much fighting, although there is also some more local fighting here, because what was also going on is that here in South Texas, there was a booming cotton bootlegging industry. Because also keep in mind that at the start of the war, that Abraham Lincoln, he puts forth the blockade. And again, I could go more detail also, in terms of all this, but he puts forth the blockade, and then this causes for the Southerners not to be able to get their cotton out. At least they can't get some of it. So instead, the Confederacy decides, hey, what if we smuggle it across the border in South Texas into Mexico and then get it out that way? So Lincoln gets wind of this, and then he decides to send troops down to Brownsville, which is, Fort Brown had been formed there, which is now modern day Texas Southmost. Which is interesting. I've said this before, that there were three major forts here in South Texas. There was Fort Brown in Brownsville. There was also Ringgold Barracks, which became Fort Ringgold over in Rio Grande City. And then there's also Fort McIntosh, which is in Laredo. What's interesting about all three of those places is that all three of them have became education centers. Two of them are colleges, like I said, Texas Southmost over in Brownsville. Fort McIntosh became Laredo College. And then Fort Ringgold has become the headquarters of Rio Grande City CISD. So it's kind of interesting that all three of them have become education centers. But just a little bit of a interesting footnote there. Okay, but let's go ahead and continue. So then we have the Union forces get to Brownsville, and they're trying to set up a blockade along the Rio Grande, but then they're repelled back in the Battle of Laredo, which was led by Santos Benavides, who was the highest-ranking Hispanic in the Confederate army. So he sends those Union troops back down the Rio Grande, back towards Brownsville. So they weren't able to move further north along the Rio Grande. So that blockade wasn't able to succeed, although they were able to blockade the Mississippi River, though, and to cut the Confederacy in two. So Texas is cut off after that happens, and then ultimately, of course, the Union defeats the Confederacy after they're basically, the Confederacy really didn't have a chance. They just did not have the resources to be able to to withstand the Union forces. And Sam Houston had the foresight to see that. That's why he did not go along with pledging his allegiance to the Confederacy, because he knew that the Confederacy just did not have the chance to win. So ultimately, the Union defeats the Confederacy with General Lee surrendering to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox House. What's also interesting, let me also give you all another interesting footnote about Robert E. Lee, is that he actually spent some time here in South Texas a couple of years before the Civil War started. Because remember, he's part of the U.S. military. He ultimately leaves the U.S. military when Virginia secedes from the Union, because the story is that he couldn't fight against his home state of Virginia, right? So he was more loyal to Virginia than the United States. So that's why ultimately, because keep in mind that Lincoln wanted Lee to lead the Union forces. Robert E. Lee was the top military mind, in the U.S. military at the time. So Robert E. Lee was going to lead the Union forces against the Confederacy, but Robert E. Lee couldn't. Like I said, he couldn't go against the state of Virginia. But anyway, we're going back to Lee and his ties to the Valley. So a few years before the Civil War happens, Robert E. Lee is in the Valley because he's trying to assist with fighting against this guy by the name of Juan Cortina, who is leading this rebellion here in South Texas to rebel against the white landowners who are trying to take land away from the native Hispanics here. So he gets repelled back into Mexico. That he tries several times to try to start an insurrection in South Texas, but he's quickly defeated and all that. So just to give another little bit of some local, again, there's tons of local history here. Most people don't know about the rich local history we have here in the Valley. Tons and tons of stuff. And again, you can look this up. It's all out there. Okay, so then of course we get to Juneteenth, which is which of course was recently made a national holiday a couple years ago. So Juneteenth, of course, obviously commemorates when the Union forces landed at Galveston to ultimately declare that the slaves were free after, to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation that had been put forth by Lincoln at the beginning of 1863, which could not be enforced until the Southern states were under Union control here. So, okay, so let's see. I know we have a little bit more to go when it comes to history. Yeah, I think we can definitely try to knock this out here. So yeah, now we'll get a little bit more into the political aspect here as well as the economy. So this shouldn't take too much longer. So we should be able to finish this, and then we can get to the rest of this, like the political culture. So yeah, we should be able to finish this by next time. Um, if we have to go over like a couple of minutes, I mean, that's fine. If y'all need to leave, that's fine. But for sure, we'll be able to knock this out next time here. So it's pretty much already going to be time to go here. So let me go ahead and stop the share and stop the recording here.